So one of the things I've continuously said is this US trade deal that we're going to get post-Brexit is going to be absolutely awful. It's going to open us up to so many different things. And not only that, but you have to accept that in the US there are lower regulations on food, on basically a whole load of things. So it's not just chlorinated chicken, which is the main thing you hear about. And in fact, this article discusses it. Now remember, this trade deal is being done behind closed doors. So once this trade deal is done and signed, if there is anything you do not like in this trade deal, tough. There's nothing you can do about it. So the British public is already scared about a trade deal with the US. They don't care for chickens washed in chlorine, nor for cows stuffed with hormones. But this week, an epic US document setting out the barriers to foreign trade it would like to remove shows that these concerns are just the tip of the iceberg. Not only do the 400 plus pages detail a stomach-churning list of foods the US would like to import into Britain, more pus in your milk and more pesticides on your vegetables, but they also uncover the US government's distaste for the way the US regulates big pharmaceutical corporations generally. The US would certainly ask us to strip away these regulations as part of a post-Brexit trade deal, which would turn pros into a direct threat to the NHS budget and our ability to get our hands on life-saving medicines in the future. So a US trade deal could be both bad for our health and bad for helping us get better again. It is reported that the US government is clear that it hates the EU's food policies, which, by the way, are currently the best in the world. So remember that, as part of the EU, we have the best food standards available in the world. Okay? And there are people that are just, oh, chlorinated chicken, it's fine. It's not, guys. It really isn't. Go and look at the science on that and how eating this has affected America's health. So, where were we? Yes, it wants to export chlorinated chicken, that's meat rinsed in anthropomorphic wash, as an alternative to keeping it and killing animals in healthy conditions, and the meat from the animals stuffed with hormone steroids, racopamine, I think that's how you say it, and endorphin disruptors, chemicals that mess with animals' hormones and can cause cancer and birth defects in the animals. The list goes on. The US is unhappy about the EU's cautious approach to approving genetically modified foods, chemically flavouring in food, and the amount of pesticide residue allowed in fruit and nuts. They even think the amount of stomach cells allowed in milk in the EU is too restrictive. The US allows more white blood cells in milk than anywhere else in the world, even though this often indicates infection in the cow. So the US argues that this is a matter of customer choice, and that it's disingenuous because importing this food will inevitably drive down standards here, and because, as we discover in the document, the US dislikes the sort of food labelling that allows the consumer to make an informed choice. And as I've said, because this will happen, because now you'll have all this cheap food flowing over, and farmers will be following, again, post-Brexit, the high regulation standards, we will have to lower those standards or else the farms will go out of business, which now means you will now have to accept a lower quality of food. And that is a big issue. If all of this is starting to make you feel queasy, it gets even worse. When you look at the treated side of the equation, medicines in the US are vastly more expensive than they are in Europe. So it's little wonder that the US is battling for big pharma, and disagrees with the very still moderate limitations that European governments have placed on pharmaceutical companies. For starters, the US complains that there is a lack of meaningful stakeholder input into these policies. In turn, this creates uncertainty and unpredictability and can undermine incentives to market and innovate further. In Britain, for instance, the NHS has some limited power to negotiate the price of medicines. This also has a framework for what is and isn't value for money. None of that is to the taste of the US administration. Indeed, it even has a problem with the then again very limited transparency of the EU that the EU puts on pharmaceutical companies to disclose drug trial dates. Drug trials are notoriously opaque, and with virtual information routinely withheld from the public in the US, it makes it harder to scrutinise the prices or even the real effectiveness of the medicines. This is the same agenda that the US has been pushing in other trade deals. The American campaign group, The Public Citizen, shows that the US routinely pushes for greater monopoly rights for pharmaceutical companies in trade deals. On the government's list of demands to make it easier to renew patents on medicines, allow an even greater degree of corporate control over clinical test data, grant new patents on biological medicines, including many new counter treatments, and give corporations a greater say in healthcare policy. All this amounts to a simple reality. If the US successfully pushes through these top-line demands in a trade deal with the UK, the NHS would either have to spend more money on drugs each year, or more patients would be denied access to those drugs. The secretive US-UK trade deal working group, led by the Trade Secretary Liam Fox, met 2 weeks ago. And we are not allowed to know about the talks, but we do know that services, investment, intellectual property rights, and enforcement and regulatory issues were discussed. That means, above all, changes in regulatory standards on food and healthcare will be the price Trump charges for a new trade deal with the UK. And we know that Liam Fox himself has few qualms about lowering food standards. So public attention is urgently needed here. But there is some good news too. First, Fox is widely out of step with the British public. An opinion poll released over the weekend shows that 82% of Brits would rather not have a trade deal with the US than sacrifice food standards. Only 8% would put a trade deal first. Second, the trade deal shelved for the time being, as Theresa May fears losing the vote on the customs union, will have to return to Parliament soon. MPs must take this opportunity to vote for powers to properly scrutinise the Trade Secretary and have the right to stop trade deals they don't like. The stakes couldn't be higher. If we don't want to give into Trump's trade demands, we must make trade policy democratic. So remember, people, you voted to take back control. And as I've said, if you allow this trade deal to go through, then you risk the NHS. And the NHS at the moment is already at a point of, it was already at a potential tipping point. This could tip it over the edge even more. So I have to ask the question, do you want Brexit, or do you want to keep the NHS? Because as I've said multiple times, you can only have one or the other.